Professor Keel, is it right then to understand from the evidence you were giving us before the break, in relation to life expectancy and improved life expectancy for haemophiliacs, was it your understanding that that was based upon the availability of factor concentrates rather than the availability of cryoprecipitate?
Yes, factor concentrates, yes. They transformed the management of the condition.
I want to explore with you this idea of best available treatment, if I may, and suggest that there might be difficulties in generalising, as the briefing did, that the treatment offered was the best available in the light of medical knowledge at the time. And what I'm going to explore with you, Professor Keel, it's quite a long question from me, but I'm going to set out some scenarios and then invite your comments as a matter of generality. In 1984, for sake of argument, it might be said that the best available treatment for a haemophiliac, whatever the level of severity of their haemophilia, might not be a concentrate infected with hepatitis C and quite possibly with HIV, but might be cryoprecipitate, or might be no treatment at all, but bed rest and management. Or in 1986, the best available treatment, say for a haemophiliac with mild haemophilia, might not be a factor concentrate at all, might be DDAVP, or might be 8Y rather than the Scottish product. Do you have any observations on that, Professor?
Well, part of the availability of factor concentrates and part of the availability of cryo, bed rest following bleeds was the only thing that was on offer. Now we know from that meant young men in the main, children, boys, spending long periods of time, mainly in hospital or at home, resting, with the associated impact on the rest of their lives, particularly education. And we also know that from a medical point of view, that didn't give good outcomes because so many of those young boys later developed severe osteoarthritis because of repeated bleeds into joints. And a number of them would have died too of fatal hemorrhage, often intracranial hemorrhage, before the availability of factor concentrates. Moving on to your scenario in 1986, yes, DDAVP was available and indeed was recognized as being the preferable treatment for mild haemophiliacs. But for severe haemophiliac patients, it wasn't powerful enough. And the availability of 8Y, which incidentally only in hindsight was proved to be safe from non-A, non-B, the method that BPL applied was only recognized, I think, in 1988 with the passage of time, not to have communicated HCV. But anyway, the main limiting factor here was the fact that BPL could not supply, well, only with great difficulty, could supply the needs of England for that product. So there was limited capacity, even if Scottish haemophilia directors had wanted to acquire 8Y in Scotland.
Would you accept, however, reflecting on the kind of issues that I referred to in my question to you, that generalising by making an assertion as the main argument against compensation that the treatment offered was the best available in the light of medical knowledge at the time, is an over-generalisation?
Yes, but for the majority of the patients, that is a true statement. But there were exceptions that we've touched on just now, particularly the mild hemophilia patients who would have benefited from DDAVP rather than being exposed to concentrates.
What about the position of the haemophiliac in say, 1984, where there may be a choice between a concentrate infected almost inevitably with hepatitis C, quite possibly infected with HIV? Would you agree that the best available treatment might well not be that concentrate transmitting potentially fatal viruses, but might be, for example, cryoprecipitate?
Yes, well, I have to say again, hindsight is a fine thing. If we'd known in 1984 what we now know about the impact of non-A, non-B hepatitis, then maybe the choice would have been to choose cryoprecipitate. But we didn't know that then. In October 1985, the SNBTS factory product was HIV safe. In 1984, there was only just the beginnings of the emergence of the possibility that that virus could be transmitted by blood products. So we were in the middle of a state of scientific flux, if you like. The virus had only been discovered in 1984, or identified in 1984. By the following year, SNBTS had a test in place, which meant that the virus was practically abolished from being transmitted by transfusion. So to go back to your case of somebody with a serious bleed, I assume is what you're talking about, and whether that should be managed in 1984 by cryo rather than factor concentrate, I think there would have been a clinical dilemma. And for example, in the case of an intracranial bleed with, a serious risk of death or severe brain damage, I think in many cases, factor concentrates would have been the best option. So it's a very complex clinical scenario.
Would you accept that where there are clinical dilemmas, where there are pros and cons of treatment, different forms of treatment, no treatment, what lies at the heart of the administration of treatment must include the informed consent of the patient?
Yes, absolutely.
And that must encompass a clinician spelling out to a patient the risks both of having the treatment and, of course, also the risks of not having the treatment.
Yes.
To what extent, in the 1990s, when the Scottish Home and Health Department was formulating or maintaining its various policy positions, here obviously the policy position is in relation to compensation, was consideration given to the question of whether patients had been treated with informed consent, whether they'd been offered proper choices?
I don't remember that being a focus of discussion. But just going back to the scenarios you described, in the mid-1980s, because by the 1990s, we were already on much firmer ground regarding the risks of transmission of these viruses by factor concentrates. We weren't in that position in the mid-1980s. I repeat, HIV only identified in 1984, Hep C only identified in 1989. So, of course, clinicians had a duty to describe to patients the risks of whatever treatment they were being offered, and I guess the option of not having any treatment. But it would have been a difficult situation for clinicians in the mid-1980s, given what I've already said about these viruses only emerging at that point. And the other point relating to non-A, non-B is, as we discussed much earlier, the perception that this was a relatively benign disease process, whatever organism was causing it. And they hadn't identified that at that point. So there wasn't, what I'm trying to say is that it would have been very difficult for clinicians to say, these are the definitive risks in this factor concentrate that I'm offering you, compared to you not having it. Because the evidence was only emerging around these viruses at that time.
Does it follow from that, Professor Keel, that in relation to the risks of non-A, non-B hepatitis, you're thinking in the 1990s, when you're advising the government on these issues, from a medical perspective, that risk didn't have to be spelt out by clinicians to patients?
In the 1990s?
No, looking at it in the 1990s, so I'm asking you to think about what your advice was in the 1990s. Was it your stance that in the course of the 1980s, clinicians did not have to advise their patients in Scotland about the risks of non-A, non-B hepatitis because of what you've described as it being thought to be a relatively benign condition?
No, I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that it would have been very difficult to describe to patients what risk they were running, because the perception was that the virus, non-A, non-B, as yet undefined, caused elevation of liver enzymes in virtually all of the recipients of these products. But the implications of that were by no means clear at all. It seemed that, and I saw these patients in the clinic with elevated enzymes. They didn't have symptoms of liver disease. They weren't complaining of liver disease symptoms. What they were complaining of was an arthritic elbow or knee. As I've said before, the general perception in the early, certainly to the mid-1980s, was that this was a relatively benign disease that only caused elevation of liver enzymes. And the other sequelae, unfortunately, only emerged over a longer period of time, by which time, of course, clinicians were informing patients anyway. When the virus was identified, all haemophilia patients were tested for it, and they would have been informed of their results.
Just, Professor Keel, just to say, I'm going to pick up on that issue, and indeed what you said earlier about the issue relating to the Scottish heat-treated product tomorrow, because the evidence you've given is not necessarily reflected in the evidence the inquiry has heard on those issues. Can I just go back to the briefing we were looking at, SCGV 40165_035, page 5. So we were looking at that sentence below subparagraph E about the main argument against compensation being the treatment offered was the best available in the light of medical knowledge at the time. And I've just been exploring with you some scenarios in relation to blood products and treatment with blood products. And I then perhaps test that main argument now in relation to the position of those who received transfusions, and again suggest that it might be difficult to generalise to the extent set out in this briefing. Would you accept, first of all, that the unnecessary use of blood, so giving transfusions where they weren't necessarily required or giving too much by way of a transfusion, was a well-known problem, later to be addressed through the Better Blood Transfusion Initiative and others, which I'll ask you about tomorrow?
Yes, well, whether it was a well-known problem at the time, I'm not absolutely confident, but certainly during my career as a haematologist, data began to indicate enormous variation in practice, transfusion practice, between similar groups of clinicians. For example, surgeons operating, cardiac surgeons, some using transfusion as a matter of routine, some others not using any blood transfusion at all. So that began to emerge during the 1990s, and in fact was a catalyst for me and many others to get the Better Blood Transfusion Programme underway. I absolutely agree that this sentence that's up here does not relate to the use of blood transfusion per se. I was reading it in the context of treatment for haemophilia. I'm not sure whether the previous paragraphs indicate that I'm correct, but that was how I was interpreting it. But I absolutely agree with you that over-transfusion, unnecessary use of blood, was not the best available treatment for those requiring or not requiring transfusion at the time.
And the reason I would suggest, Professor Keel, that this assertion is looking at both blood products, which is referred to in the previous subparagraph, and transfusion, is of course what the paragraph then goes on to say. Whilst this is true, are weaknesses that other countries did introduce the test for HCV earlier than the UK and in Belgium. And that must, I think, be a reference to the introduction of screening in the blood transfusion service in 1991. Again, just to explore with you the issue about treatment in the form of blood transfusion being the best available, and leaving aside the potential weakness that was identified in this paragraph in terms of the period of time before HCV screening was introduced, it might also be said that in the context of blood transfusion, the best available treatment for those who genuinely required a blood transfusion and for whom there was no alternative might nonetheless be blood to which there had been an element of testing through the use of surrogate testing before the availability of the HCV screening test.
Well, I alluded, you alluded earlier to the non-introduction of ALT testing in the UK, although of course it was adopted by many other countries. And the reasons for its non-adoption in the UK were the non-specificity of that test, which means that it would have, if we'd introduced this to the donor screening panel of tests, there would have been many, many false positives, i.e. people whose ALT level was raised for other reasons, such as alcohol, use, obesity, and there are a number of other conditions which can give rise to ALT rises, not least all the other viruses that can affect the liver. So it was decided in the main, given to in the main due to the number of false positives that would arise, that this would not be a good idea. It would not be a good screening test. For example, if a donor tests positive for a virus, any of the tests that are routinely applied, obviously they're offered counselling. What would you say to someone whose ALT was elevated? That they may or may not have a viral infection, or maybe the ALT elevation is due to the fact that they are drinking too much alcohol, or that they are overweight. So on those grounds, it was decided that it was not a good screening test.
I'm going to leave that paragraph for now and just look at the rest of the document with you, if I may, Professor. So if we look at yes.
May I have a look at the previous paragraph?
Of course. If we have, so on screen you should see the previous two sub-paragraphs, and then we can look at the previous page. So these were said to be the 5 reasons for the government opposing no-fault compensation. Those are the last 2 on the page.
If you go to the paragraph that you've referred to that says that this argument against compensation is the best available in the light of medical knowledge, and you said that this document refers to transfusion as well as factor concentrates. Could I just refresh my
If we go
memory
to,
of that?
yes, of course, if we go to the first page, the heading is payments for those infected with hepatitis C through blood transfusion / blood products. And then the first paragraph refers in the 3rd line to through blood or blood products. So it would appear to be addressing both.
My reading of the subsequent paragraph was more limited than it should have been. My interpretation was more limited, so apologies for that.
So if we go back to page 5, the bottom half of the page now, the heading HIV settlement is a precedent. Paragraph 12 says the HIV settlement is being cited as a precedent, and then it refers to the Department of Health arguing that there were special factors applying to that situation, and then 3 factors are there set out, the first of which is the fatal nature of HIV, the second is, I think, a longhand for stigma, and then the third is the double disadvantage of haemophilia and HIV. If we go over the page, this is the view being recorded in Mr. Snedden's draft briefing, paragraph 13. It does seem to us, however, that the HIV settlement represents a powerful precedent. We do not believe that it is reasonable that different policies should apply in respect of 2 different but both serious and potentially fatal viruses. In addition, HCV carries its own social stigma, since it is often associated with intravenous drug misuse. One of the main demands of the Haemophilia Society campaign is a public education programme. Furthermore, the prognosis and risk of transmission for those, mainly haemophiliacs, infected with both viruses is worse than for those infected with HIV alone. So it appears to be, as recorded there, the settled view within the Scottish Home and Health Department at this point in time, which is 95, that there isn't a good basis for distinguishing HIV from hepatitis C. We don't see that, I think, reflected in some of the later documentation, which we'll come on to. But what was your understanding at the time of the department's position?
Well, again, I'm struggling to remember, because you're right, this does vary from subsequent positions taken. I can't remember really having any discussion with, was Ian Snedden put this forward? Yeah, with him about this paragraph. And actually, I don't really agree wholly with it. It seemed to me at the time and now that HIV, when the assistance scheme was set up, was a very much more serious disease than HCV. We all remember that the campaigns, don't die of ignorance. It was a really enormous, perceived as an enormous public health threat. I worked as a locum at St Mary's Hospital in London, which was a place which looked after many HIV/AIDS sufferers. And I used to, when required, do bone marrow examinations on them. So I saw at firsthand the devastating effect that HIV had within a relatively short period of time after acquiring the virus to developing AIDS and inevitable death at that point, because of course this is long before antiviral treatments appeared. So I don't really wholly agree with what Ian is saying here. And I don't think the social stigma around HCV is anything like as hyped as the problems that HIV sufferers encountered. The only thing I would agree with wholeheartedly is that, of course, if you get both viruses, then you're going to do worse. You're going to get much iller much quicker. So this is a slight puzzle to me, this paragraph.
It may be a fair reading of this paragraph. It's not to say that HIV and HCV are identical, but to say the same treatment is engaged and that they are both serious and potentially fatal viruses. Would you accept that as at 1995, leave aside for the moment the position in relation to earlier years, it's accurate to describe HCV as a serious and potentially fatal virus?
Yes, I would.
And in terms of stigma, this doesn't on its face read as though Mr. Snedden is saying the social stigma associated with hepatitis C is identical to the stigma associated with HIV, but he's saying it does carry its own stigma for the reason he sets out. And would you agree that hepatitis C was known to be stigmatising, in particular because of the association with IVDU?
Yes, but I repeat, not to the same degree as HIV. Positive individuals were stigmatised in the 1980s.
If we then just continue more quickly through the rest of this document, there's a summary of the Department of Health proposals. I don't propose to read through that. If we go to the next page, there's a heading numbers and costs, and it talks about, it gives an estimate of possible numbers and possible costs. If we go over the page, there's reference to CJD and human growth hormone patients, and then there's a heading Treasury and a reference to the position or anticipated position of the Treasury to any financial assistance. And then if we go to the next page, we just pick it up under the heading Conclusion. Mr. Snedden says this at paragraph 22, mounting pressure in the political arena and the pending legal actions make it increasingly difficult to hold the line for no compensation. And then there's reference to the Haemophilia Society's campaign, and then picking it up in the sixth line, continued adverse publicity about blood safety risks damaging public confidence in the system. There's also the question of whether the case for not offering compensation is sufficiently robust to hold up, particularly in view of the Baxter settlement and the precedent set by payments already made to those infected with HIV. And then it continues, we've considered the administrative, legal and medical implications of the proposed compromise of paying compensation to those infected with HCV on the basis of need and or the harm they've suffered. but the difficulties likely to be encountered above appear to make such a scheme unworkable. Legal and medical opinion suggest that there's no realistic option but to compensate all those infected through contaminated blood products on equal terms, the only compromise possible being on the amount of the settlement. And this is the line we are taking in responding to the Department of Health. Now, we'll see how the Department of Health then deals with the issue shortly. But that being the view set out by Mr Snedden, increasingly difficult to hold the line, no realistic option but to compensate all those infected through contaminated blood products on equal terms. That being the advice in June of 1995, what's your understanding as to why it was not for another 8 years that the Scottish Government decided that there should be some form of financial assistance to those infected with hepatitis C?
I suspect, at least in part for the reasons that I've just outlined, that HIV was seen as a uniquely awful disease, which merited a precedent being set. But in other cases, although of course there are similarities, great similarities between HIV and HCV, but there was a desire to maintain the HIV assistance, financial assistance, as a unique precedent and not to set or to enshrine other cases such as HCV with the same status, because it was well known that there were other, and I've already alluded to this, other groups of patients out there suffering from entirely different conditions who might feel that they had a right to compensation or financial assistance in the same way as would be offered to HCV sufferers.
And can you give us some examples of the other groups about whom you or your colleagues were particularly concerned, who might point to the provision of assistance to those infected through blood and suggest, or blood products, and suggest that they were therefore entitled to similar support?
Well, there's certainly a couple that come to mind. There was a group, I think it was called RAGE, Radiotherapy Action Group. I can't remember what the E stood for, but they were a group that formed to highlight the problems that women with breast cancer had encountered following radiotherapy. And they were seeking compensation. Another was a product called Myodil, which was a contrast medium for visualizing the spine. It was injected into the spinal cord and caused inflammation. So that was another group that were looking for compensation. And there would have been others out there, I can't remember. So the view that HCV should not be added to the precedent set by HIV was founded on that context.
And do you know whether either of those groups that you referred to were using the HIV settlement as the argument as to why they should be compensated?
I don't know.
Just to complete the picture in relation to the 1995 decision-making, SCGV 0000166_054 this is a letter from the Department of Health England. It's from Mr Guinness to Mr Snedden, 13th of October 1995. We can see from the handwriting at the top that it says Dr Keel for information, so it would have been, it looks like copied to you. And we can see Mr Guinness says in the first paragraph, it's important that we keep in regular touch over this issue to ensure a consistent presentation of policy, which, as you say, is ultimately a matter for collective consideration by government. Your concerns over the operational difficulty of any compensation scheme are well taken. As I understand it, part of Roger Schofield's intention in proposing a model was to expose the problems of appropriately targeting resources in the face of a disease of such uncertain history and variable effects. I do think this will prove useful groundwork in the event that there is a change in policy. And then there's reference to the scheme in the Republic of Ireland. And then it says, as you'll be aware, my Secretary of State has made it clear that there's currently no prospect of such a change in his mind. The expense and associated opportunity cost of any settlement are significant factors, but the main plank of resistance remains opposition to the principle of a no-fault compensation scheme. In evidence to the Health Committee Public Expenditure Inquiry on the 19th of July, the Secretary of State, and pausing there, that is a reference to Stephen Dorrell, as I understand it, the then Secretary of State for Health in England, acknowledged that there was an illogicality in the payment to HIV-infected patients given that principle. However, he did not see this as sufficient reason to err from it. And so it's right, I think, that following the exchange of documents that we've looked at, and there are others that I'm not going to spend time looking at, but in 1995, although consideration was given in the way in which we've explored to the possibility of introducing some form of financial support for those infected with hepatitis C, that did not go anywhere in Scotland.
Yes.
I'm going to pick matters up then in 1998, which appears to be, at least from the available documentation, the next occasion in which the matter was expressly considered. If we go, please, to SCGV 40167_178. This is a minute from Rachel Sunderland, PS Mr Galbraith, 29th of July 1998, and it's addressed to Mr Nicol, and then it's copied to a number of individuals. It's clearly copied at ministerial level, and it's copied to you, although you're down as Mr Keel rather than Dr Keel on that list. It says, Mr Galbraith has seen your minute of the 28th of July informing him that Mr Dobson was due to announce yesterday that the Department of Health will not be offering compensation to individuals infected with HCV through NHS treatment. As discussed with you by telephone, Mr Galbraith is content with the recommendation to adopt a similar position in Scotland and with the proposed lines to take, subject to the deletion of the fourth bull point. We'll see what that refers to in a moment. The Minister has noted the if pressed line and would be grateful if this could be held back. However, if it was to be issued, then the Minister would be grateful if the phrase public revulsion could be deleted. And again, we'll see what that refers to. Now, Mr Dobson is Frank Dobson, by this time Secretary of State for Health in the UK government. And Mr Galbraith was who?
He was the Health Secretary at that point in Scotland. He was, as it so happens, a doctor. He was a neurosurgeon.
So it's July 1998, so we're still pre-devolution. So he was a health minister in the Scottish Home and Health Department, is that right?
Yes.
And then the document that is being referred to in this minute is at SCGV 40167_181. And we can see this is from Andy Nicol, Healthcare Policy Division, to Mr Galbraith's private office. Again, copied to you. You're correctly referred to as Doctor rather than Mr Keel on this occasion. And then we can see that the purpose of the briefing in paragraph 1 is to advise Mr Galbraith that Mr Dobson will today be announcing that the Department of Health will not be offering compensation to individuals infected with hepatitis C through NHS treatment, and to recommend that a similar position be adopted in Scotland. And then if we go towards the bottom of the page, we see reference under the heading background to the Haemophilia Society's campaign. I'm not going to read through that. If we go over the page, We can see paragraph 5 describes the previous administration having rejected claims for a compensation scheme, and then various grounds are set out, and the first refers again to that line to take a best available treatment. If we go to the next page, we can see the heading Scottish Considerations just over halfway down the page. And paragraph 9 reads, there are 122 known cases of HCV-positive Scottish patients who've been infected through blood transfusions or blood products. It's likely that today's announcement will lead to a number of actions for compensation being raised against the government. And in Scotland, there are currently 10 to 12 pending court actions. If Mr Galbraith agrees to adopt a similar position to the Secretary of State for Health, we can expect the remainder of the 122 Scottish cases to request legal aid to pursue claims for damages. And then the recommendation in paragraph 10, this issue has always been viewed as a UK-wide matter, which requires the 4 territorial health departments to adopt a consistent line. Mr Dobson's announcement therefore effectively binds Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland to following the same line. Unfortunately, Department of Health officials were unable to give us prior warning of this announcement. We were first advised yesterday afternoon. However, we see no reason to deviate from the decision reached by the Secretary of State for Health and would recommend that Mr Galbraith agree to adopt a similar position in Scotland. And we know from that minute that we looked at that Mr Galbraith did indeed accept that recommendation. And then if we go over the page, the line to take, in the likely event of media inquiries, I would suggest the following line to take. The first refers to great sympathy and personal tragedy. The second is this. This has been a very hard decision for the government to take on a complex issue, which is why it has taken so long to come to a view. Now, just pausing there, this briefing doesn't necessarily read as reflecting a very hard decision for the government to take on a complex issue. It reads as Scotland effectively falling into line behind the decision of Mr Dobson in England. Are you able to tell us whether, from your perspective, there was indeed a long period of consideration resulting in a very hard decision for the government to take?
Well, I think the chronology here indicates that there was quite a long period, because the previous document you put up, the DH letter, I think it was 1995, and this submission dates from 1998, is that right?
That's right, although it's not currently clear to me what, if anything, in terms of active contemplation of this issue was taking place in the intervening period.
And I'm afraid I can't enlighten you on that. I mean, a lot of this kind of discussion around possible compensation schemes would have been led very much by policy colleagues and legal advisors, rather than the medical side of the House. I mean, obviously, my view was taken on the medical comments included in submissions, but the direction of policy was very much driven by policy colleagues.
And then we can see there that the 4th bullet point is crossed out, and that is presumably a reflection of the minute from Mr Galbraith's office, which had said this is agreed subject to deletion of the 4th bullet point. Now, that 4th bullet point is this: we accept that there's a low level of public understanding of hepatitis C and are therefore committed to looking into how we might improve information and education in this area. First of all, would you say it was broadly correct in Scotland in 1998 that there was a low level of public understanding of hepatitis C?
I honestly can't say. I suspect, given that the virus had been only identified less than 10 years previously, there probably was a relatively low understanding. I can't be sure of that.
And does it concern you, looking at this now, and bearing in mind that obviously your input was as medical advisor, that the the suggested commitment to looking into how information and education in this area might be improved has been crossed through as a result of the Minister's decision?
Well, I don't think that that means that there were all moves to improve education and information were abandoned. I mean, for example, Health Protection Scotland, an agency of Scottish Health Service, were very involved on the public health, in the area of public health, in producing materials around hepatitis C. So I don't think the Minister scoring this line out means that he didn't want any efforts to improve information and education.
If we just go down to a little further down the page, I don't have a question to ask you about it, but we can see there the if pressed, that the words or public revulsion crossed out, and I refer to that just to make sense of what was said in the accompanying minute. If we just go back to the previous page, and back to paragraph 10, the bottom of the page, the assertion there, it's always been viewed in a UK-wide matter that the 4 territorial health departments are required to adopt a consistent line, and that Frank Dobson's announcement effectively binds Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Do you have any understanding as to why that was believed to be the case? Why couldn't Scotland, or indeed Wales or Northern Ireland, go it alone and introduce a financial support scheme if they wished to?
Well, I think in law they could have. The point, though, I think material point, would have been that had Scotland decided to go ahead with the scheme and England had decided against it, then public perception would have been very confused. There would have been inequity in supporting patients south of the border and in other parts of the UK. So it was seen as desirable to move forward on a UK-wide basis. But I don't think England could have dictated to Scotland not to go ahead with such a scheme. However, what Scotland would have had to do was to find the funding for such a scheme from its block grant.
Well, that's a theme we'll no doubt pick up tomorrow when we look at what happened in 2002, 2003. So I'm going to move now to the issue of the Scottish Executive's inquiry, internal inquiry in 1999-2000. Can I suggest that we pick that up in the morning rather than me starting it now?
Yes. Just before we stop for the evening, I wonder if you could help me with something. Can we just go back to the previous page on this document that is currently on the screen? And it's paragraph 5 there. It's saying what the previous administration had done. It had rejected claims for a compensation scheme on the grounds. And I'm just interested in the formulation of what is said at the beginning in the light of some of the evidence that you've been asked about this afternoon. And it's that the patients concerned received the best treatment available at the time, given the state of knowledge about HCV and the lack of a reliable screening test. You told Council that you, I think by the time that this was written, you accepted that it was known that hepatitis C was a serious disease with potential long-term serious consequences, which could be fatal. Now, if one were to add to that the potential for somebody who is a carrier of that disease and isn't detected because of a lack of an appropriate test, let's say, that would add to the reservoir of those who had infection in the community. That would be a matter of interest, I suppose, to government, the public health wing, because it would want to prevent that pool developing and leading to further problems, would it not?
Yes.
Now, let us suppose, this is purely hypothetical, given the state of knowledge about HCV, plainly that's referring to 1998. If you or somebody in your position had been, as CMO or Deputy CMO in Scotland, let's suppose, been advising or in a position to advise ministers in 1980, 18 years before, just picking a date, that indeed hepatitis was potentially fatal. It was a severe disease or serious disease with potential serious long-term consequences. And it added to the reservoir of infection in the community. Do you think that what then followed after that would have been what could be described as the best treatment that should have been given? Or would it have altered, do you think, the treatment available? And would you have advised ministers that they should do something about it? Or might wish to do something about it? It's a hypothetical question, but I'd be interested in your view.
So what you're asking me is, if in 1980,
I'm exploring the question of how relevant the state of knowledge about HCV is to what is being done, because that's the connection made here. And I'm picking 1980 as a date. And suppose that had been known at the time.
If it was known then that hepatitis C was indeed a serious infection which could lead to death in some circumstances, yes, of course that would have changed the advice given, and I dare say the political perception of the need to do something.
Well, thank you very much. I thought that would be your answer, but I needed to ask you to find out, because you're in that position of giving advice or being in a position to advise government, or were, and it's the sense of what would have merited politicians being told at that time. But thank you very much for that. We'll take a break now until tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. The same rules, of course, apply about discussing your evidence, Professor Keel. But I wish you a good evening and look forward to seeing you again tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.